Thanks for watching. I'm Shakil 5858. I am Amir Budnam. Now the news from the world channels. GMT 700 March 10, 2024. Republican Party future if the Trump wins the elections. College admission test SAT goes digital. Immigrant story. Ramadan and the families of Gaza. Food shipment from Cyprus. Israel continue bombing Gaza. Attack by Houthi of Yemen. Biden signed the shutdown bill. Helicopter crash in Texas. UFOs. Basketball record. Senegal protests. I am thankful to our news resources. Now the news in detail.
Tonight on PBS News Weekend, with Trump's commanding win on Super Tuesday, we look at the present and future of the Republican Party. Then, as the SAT goes digital, what the change means for accessibility and the role of the test in college admissions.
By making it shorter, making it digital, even making it adaptive are all ways to make it more attractive to students.
And the daughter of Somali immigrants gives her brief but spectacular take on caring for refugees and immigrants who have survived violence.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions and friends of the News Hour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Laura Barone-Lopez. John Yang is away. Tonight, on the eve of Ramadan, the Muslim holy month of fasting, hundreds of thousands of Gazans are on the brink of famine, according to UN officials. Gazans scrambled for food, airdropped by the U.S. and Jordan today, while hundreds of miles north, a ship loaded with 200 metric tons of food is set to sail from the island of Cyprus. The voyage will test a new maritime corridor for aid and should reach Gaza in the next few days. Meanwhile, attacks continue both inside Gaza and in the wider region. Israel destroyed a large residential tower in Rafah it says was being used by Hamas, displacing hundreds of Palestinian civilians. And the U.S. military and coalition partners downed dozens of drones launched by Houthi rebels in Yemen that threatened U.S. destroyers and a cargo ship in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, the largest Houthi attack in months. President Biden signed 6 spending bills into law today that will fund less than half of the federal government through the fall. It averts the threat of a partial government shutdown, but only for 2 weeks. The rest of the government must be funded by March 22nd. As the general election fight begins, President Biden and former President Trump will hold dueling rallies tonight in Georgia. 2 National Guardsmen and a Border Patrol agent were killed in a helicopter crash in Texas yesterday afternoon along the U.S.-Mexico border. Another soldier on board was injured. They were flying a border security mission when their UH-72 Lakota helicopter went down near Rio Grande City, north of McAllen. The cause of the crash is under investigation. If you've ever spotted an unidentified object in the sky, a new Pentagon report says you can probably rule out aliens. The congressionally mandated investigation examined reports of UFO sightings dating back to the end of World War II. And although it acknowledged a small number of cases with potentially anomalous or concerning characteristics, it found no evidence of extraterrestrial activity and said there's no alien cover-up within the government. A second volume of the report is expected later this year. And Iowa's Caitlin Clark has added yet another record to her resume, this time breaking the NCAA Division I record for 3-pointers made in a single season. She sunk her 163rd three-pointer during last night's Big Ten quarterfinal win over Penn State. With the bucket, she passed Liberty University's Darius McKee and Golden State Warriors and former Davidson star Steph Curry. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, what the new SAT means for college admissions, and a brief but spectacular take on caring for survivors of violence.
This is PBS News Weekend from WETA Studios in Washington, home of the PBS News Hour, weeknights on PBS.
Starting today, the SAT, the standardized college admissions test, is going fully digital. The test, once known for its number 2 pencils and fill-in-the-bubble answer sheets, will no longer be offered on paper. It's part of a larger redesign meant to make the test more accessible and fair, even as colleges and universities around the country have increasingly made the test optional for applicants. The change is renewing debate over the role the test should play in admissions. Nadra Niddle, education reporter for the 19th News, joins me to discuss. Nadra, thanks so much for talking to us. What exactly is changing for students who are taking the test today?
So as you mentioned, the SAT is going digital in the United States for the first time. It actually went digital internationally last year, but for US students, this will be a new experience. The test will also be about an hour shorter than the pencil and paper version, and it will be adaptive, meaning that the questions students get answered depend on how well they do at the outset.
Why did the College Board, the nonprofit that runs SAT programs, make this change?
Well, I think one of the reasons is just, young people today, teenagers, they're digital natives. So this will be very familiar to a lot of them. Changing this format in the paper version was considered outdated. Some of my sources told me that they also think this is a way to make the test more attractive as colleges and universities increasingly make it an optional admissions requirement. So by making it shorter, making it digital, even making it adaptive are all ways to make it more attractive to students.
Do these changes do anything to address some of the long-standing complaints about the SAT that it plays into inequities, especially for girls, students of color, and low-income students?
So I've heard some mixed responses from my sources about this topic. There really is nothing necessarily in the test in terms of the questions you would get asked that would make it I guess, easier or narrow the gaps for some students in terms of their performance. But some people think even just by making it shorter, that might help students with learning differences. Even by making it adaptive, some of my sources think that can make students less anxious and that can improve their scores. In terms of gender, race, and some of the other gaps, we just don't know. My expert sources are waiting to get data, which they probably won't have enough of until next year, to really look at the subgroups and how subgroups performed on the test.
So overall, are your sources telling you that this digital test may give some students a leg up or may be a disadvantage to others?
So some are saying, especially with students for learning differences, just by making it shorter, just by having adaptive, questions instead of giving everyone the same questions, that could be helpful. But some of my other sources who have been long-term critics of the SAT don't think this test is really going to do anything different. They think it's the same test. It's just a little shorter, and now it's digital instead of on paper.
Disadvantaged low-income students may not be able to afford extracurriculars or coaching on college essays, things that could help them overall boost their college admission applications. And so is there a concern that with making the SAT optional, which some universities have done, that could hurt those low-income students?
Some of the SAT supporters are arguing that, hey, if a student from a socioeconomically disadvantaged background happens to take the SAT and does really well on it, that student might qualify for scholarships. They also might qualify for admission at an elite institution that maybe just by grades alone, they wouldn't have been admitted to. So there's an attitude of, why not just take the test, see if you do well on it, and if you do, submit the scores. The other thing is during the pandemic, when the test optional movement really started to gain ground, a lot of students who were applying to Ivy League institutions and other elite institutions were still turning in their test scores anyway. So by making it now a requirement again, some of my sources believe they actually are leveling the playing field.
The SAT, as you know, used to be mandatory for first-year applications. That number dropped during the pandemic, and now schools are returning to that requirement, but others aren't. So is the SAT still an important part of college admissions?
I definitely think it's still an important part, especially for those, the top tier students who are really trying to get into the best schools in the country. At the same time, according to one advocacy group called Fair Test, only 20% of colleges are requiring the SAT. So more than 80% of colleges and universities still do not have it as a requirement. It's test optional, and they think that the test optional movement is here to stay.
Nadra Niddle of the 19th News, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Donald Trump is the presumptive GOP nominee for president after a near sweep on Super Tuesday. But when his last major opponent standing, Nikki Haley, dropped out this week, she didn't throw her support behind Trump. Despite calling on Haley voters to support him, Trump made clear he doesn't want anyone critical of him in the party.
The greatest movement in the history of our country. And they say, always trying to demean, well, MAGA really represents 48% of the Republican Party. No, it represents 96% and maybe 100%. We're getting rid of the Romneys of the world. We want to get Romneys and those out.
Exit polls tell a slightly different story. A third of Republican primary voters in North Carolina and Virginia said they would not vote Republican in November, regardless of the nominee. Tuesday's elections did more than just decide the Republican nomination. They reflected a deep schism in the party, dividing some lifelong Republicans from Trump's MAGA faction. To discuss this, I'm joined today by two Republicans, former Congressman Denver Riggleman from Virginia and strategist Barrett Marson, who's based in Phoenix. Denver and Barrett, thank you so much for joining. Denver, I want to start with you. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell endorsed Trump within 24 hours after his Super Tuesday wins. That's the same man, Mitch McConnell, who called Trump morally and practically responsible for the January 6th insurrection. Does McConnell's attempt at unity reflect the reality for voters?
Yeah, I think it does. If you look at McConnell, it's no different than what McCarthy did after January 6th when he rolled over and showed his belly and went to Mar-a-Lago after he blamed Trump for January 6th. You see all these individuals coming home, and I think a lot of it has to do with what I call liege politics. It's like, my liege, I will do what thou will hast me do, something like that. It's just absolutely unbelievable to me. But again, what did Trump get? About 75% of the vote. A lot of people said there were individuals that would not vote for Trump and things of that nature, but most people do come home. I remember in my little convention in a church, everybody saying Denver will never, vote for this guy. He's awful. But they did.
Barrett, Denver says that Republicans will come home, but a majority of Haley voters in both North Carolina and Virginia said that if Trump is convicted of a crime, that he's unfit to be president. As a lifelong Republican yourself, do you think that the former president is unfit for office?
It's going to be up to voters to decide whether Trump is unfit, but he is certainly wrong, and he's wrong for this time. There's no doubt Nikki Haley would trounce Joe Biden, certainly in Arizona. It would not be a competitive state, but because Donald Trump and all his many faults are going to be presented to us voters here in Arizona and across the country, it's going to be a very competitive race because of that.
Barrett, why do you think that he's wrong?
Well, look, he has got so many faults. If not for January 6th, certainly this campaign and most of his time out of office has shown he is much more interested in settling scores and going after his political enemies than actually doing anything. And I don't think that's where most Americans are. I think they want a much a rosier outlook on life. They don't want grievance politics. And that's truly what Trump is all about for the last, 3.5 years while he's been out of office.
Denver, I'd like to drill down a little bit to the state results in Super Tuesday contest. In Texas, specifically, GOP Congressman Tony Gonzalez is facing a runoff now from the right because of the fact that he was supportive of bipartisan gun safety legislation. He's supportive of gay marriage. What do you think? I mean, he may still very well win that contest in the general, but what's your takeaway from that?
Well, what happened to me when I officiated a same-sex wedding law? I got censured, by the local Republican Party. So it wasn't great, winning bipartisan gun legislation. The fact that I was pro-immigration for H-2As in a rural agricultural district, that pretty much got me drummed out. The Republican Party ran away from me in this district as fast as they could, based on those topics, which seem to be moderate and sane. I think when you heard Trump talking about pushing out everybody that's like Romney, that's really pushing out people like me too. You're talking about the moderate and the sane. People try to compromise. Really what the Constitution was all about when the founders set up, this incredible experiment that we have in the United States of America. I think what we have is the sane and the moderate are being run out of the party. It's either Trump, his way, or it's the highway.
I want to echo something that Denver said. Elections are about bringing in the biggest amount of voters you can get, the most amount of people, the biggest tent. And continually we hear from Donald Trump and people like Carrie Lake that they don't want moderate Republicans to vote for them. They want to excise them from the party. Well, they are without a home. Those voters, like myself in Denver, are sort of without a home. So it's either don't vote for Trump and don't vote for Biden, or maybe cast your vote for Biden because at least he wants my vote.
Speaking of Carrie Lake, Senator Kristen Sinema said that she is not going to run for re-election in your home state of Arizona. And establishment Republican figures like Senator John Thune have thrown their support behind Carrie Lake, who's running in the Republican primary for that Senate seat. How would you compare, Carrie Lake is an election denier, and she was considered a more extreme candidate in 2022. How would you compare the state's Republican Party in Arizona to the larger Republican Party?
Well, look, there is absolutely no doubt we are a MAGA base. Carrie Lake will do well in the primary. She has a primary opponent. She'll do well in the primary here. There's no doubt about that. because this is a MAGA base, but it'll be very difficult for her to win over independents and moderate Republicans who are needed to win a general election. And probably the only thing she has going for her is Ruben Gallego, her likely Democratic opponent, is a fairly liberal. He's a progressive liberal Democrat, and he may be too liberal for a lot of independents and right-leaning Republicans to actually fill in the ballot for. So it's a long ways, 7-8 months till election day. But Carrie Lake is going to have a real hard problem moderating her positions compared to 2022. Carrie Lake of 2024, her worst enemy is Carrie Lake from 2 years ago.
Denver, North Carolina, Trump endorsed Mark Robinson when the GOP nomination for the governor's race there. Robinson has called LGBTQ people, quote, filth. He has quoted Hitler. He has cast doubt on the Holocaust. And a recent HuffPost report revealed that in 2020, Robinson even said he wanted to turn back time on women's rights.
It's like John Thune endorsing Carrie Lake, and it's like this, crazy cat in North Carolina. It's like Republicans are voting for people that believe that Lord of the Rings is a documentary. And I love the fact that, both of us think, we don't have a home. I think we do. I think at some point you got to make a decision, how you're going to vote, whether it's for this country or it's for insanity. And you look at Mark, Robinson, look at North Carolina, the fact that he got the votes that he did should shock anybody, with an IQ above moron. But I do believe, as the election gets closer, if Joe Biden were to win, I think it's a couple issues. I think it's Dobbs. I think women are going to come in hard. But I also think it's, people screaming and carrying the rhino flag. I think that might overcome the MAGA flag, right? When you see people that are center-right independents, or even, I would say people who thought they were Trumpian going into this election cycle. And I also believe those independents and center-right who just can't stomach the insanity of Donald Trump or the Carrie Lakes or the Mark Robinsons from North Carolina.
Denver Riggleman, former congressman from Virginia, and Barrett Marson of Arizona. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks,
Laura.
Lul Mohamud is the executive director of a nonprofit organization that supports survivors of domestic violence. The daughter of Somali immigrants focuses her work on helping those from the African immigrant and refugee community around Washington, D.C. Tonight, she shares her brief but spectacular take on the power and promise of person-centered care.
For our survivors, who are often retelling stories of violence, of times that they don't want to reflect on, they don't want to repeat. It's already exhausting to do that. Then imagine having to worry about the feelings of the one who's listening to you. It makes it that much harder to disclose violence. It makes it that much harder to reach for help. I was blessed to be born into the Somali immigrant community here in the DC area. My siblings and I, we were very service-oriented at a really young age. Domestic violence is a long continuing global pandemic. I actually volunteered for the Person Center after my first year of college, and I met the founder and executive director then, Amelia Misailedes. The Person Center is a small community-based nonprofit that serves African immigrant survivors of domestic violence in the DC area. What she wanted for me to do was to learn a really important skill, which is the power of listening. We have to call the survivors and talk to them about their experience. And all she said was, your goal here is just to listen. And it was the hardest thing to do. We are too often judging, policing, and dictating how others emote and live their lives, instead of putting the responsibility on us to listen accurately and to listen empathetically. And if we're unable to listen, then we're unable to care for the people who need us most. After that summer, I knew that my focus needs to be on those who are most desperate to be heard and who deserve to be heard. And I tell our community all the time that as an organization made by them, our priority is to make sure that they are part of the process from beginning to the end. And in order to decolonize domestic violence response, we have to center and value and trust the voices of survivors in the very community that we say we want to serve. Violence in the context of families and interpersonal relationships has existed since the dawn of time. The experiences that our survivors have had to hold on to, the challenges they experience in receiving care, are challenges that I recognize and I experience in my own life, because I come from the same background, same community. When leaders, policymakers, researchers don't come from that community and don't have a personal tie to the challenges that these survivors are experiencing, it's very unlikely that they'll be able to find the solution. My name is Lul Mahmoud, and this is my brief but spectacular take on the power and promise of person-centered care.
And that is PBS News Weekend for this Saturday. I'm Laura Barone-Lopez. For all of my colleagues, thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is Pocket Dial. Well, somebody's pocket.
Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular,
You get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing.
have a nice day. On this Saturday night, a community united in grief. Hundreds gather in an Ottawa suburb remembering the victims of Wednesday's mass killing.
It's really hard to see that this happened.
The stories of support and shattered hearts. Gaza's hunger crisis deepens despite increased aid efforts.
In recognition of the serious and significant processes that the United Nations has undertaken.
The desperation and fears of a full-scale Israeli offensive in Rafah. Hunting for hidden emissions. The satellite launch marking a new era in methane accountability. Incredible and invincible.
Thinking that the little Canadian film is going to change everything is a bit hard to believe.
A Canadian short film driven by a director's personal story of loss makes its way to the Oscars.
Global National with Farah Nasser, reporting tonight, YouTube Gotcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. A somber and tearful day in an Ottawa neighborhood where more than 300 people gathered to honor the 6 victims of a horrific mass killing. Community members mourning the loss of Darshni Aiken-Aika and her 4 children, the youngest just 2 months old, who were murdered on Wednesday. An adult family friend was also killed. All were from Sri Lanka and were newcomers to Canada. A 19-year-old man who had been living with the family remains in custody, charged in connection with the killings. The lone survivor of the attack, the father of the family, remains in hospital. As David Aiken reports, once he's released, there will be an entire community ready to support him.
A solemn moment, a time for reflection and fellowship. At a community park just a block away from the home where the Wickramasinghe family were building their new life in Canada.
Ottawa Sri Lankan community, I know you're hurting, and we are hurting with you.
Those who knew the mother and her 4 children shared photos and memories.
My daughter played with their kids a lot at the temple, where they were all playing together. So it's really hard to see that this happened.
The father, Danushka, is recovering from 2 surgeries he needed because of wounds suffered in the attack that killed his family and a family friend living with him. Arrangements are being made to bring family members to Ottawa from Sri Lanka and to repatriate the family friend's remains.
I think next few days they can come here. So that's what we are expecting. Everybody is helping us.
The tragedy has made headlines the world over.
Yesterday we get over 300 telephone calls from all over Canada and England, Europe, and from Sri Lanka.
The monks at the Buddhist temple where Danushka and his family prayed are ready to take him in when he's...
Yesterday we get over 300 telephone calls from all over Canada and England, Europe, and from Sri Lanka.
The monks at the Buddhist temple where Danushka and his family prayed are ready to take him in when he's discharged from hospital and care for him.
It may take time for him to forget. I cannot say forget, but feel some freedom from this suffering.
Those at this vigil struggle to come to terms with the senseless violence.
We're just a few houses down from where it happened, and it's been weighing heavy on a lot of us, and it's tough to be able to find an outlet. It's nice to see everyone together and to be able to have the space to grieve. I know it's going to take a long time, and I really feel for the family and all the friends involved.
What the kids went through to me is the hardest thing, to be honest. And I have young kids as well.
Meanwhile, the family says some autopsies are now complete, and that means there may be some funerals early next week. Community members that gathered here today gave each other comfort and consolation, but everyone is haunted by the same question: why? How could this have happened? What could the motive possibly have been? And those are the questions that are driving the ongoing police investigation. Answers? Maybe. Next week. David Aiken, Global News, Ottawa.
The body of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney has arrived in Canada ahead of his state funeral. Mulroney's family members were on the tarmac at Ottawa's airport Friday as the casket arrived. The 84-year-old passed away in a Florida hospital last Thursday. His funeral will be held in Montreal on March 23rd. On the eve of Ramadan, there are fears of a full-scale Israeli ground offensive in Rafah, where more than 1 million people have sought shelter. And getting aid to those civilians by land or sea is a top priority. The United Nations says a quarter of Gaza's population is on the brink of famine, and Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry says at least 25 children have now died from malnutrition and dehydration. The Spanish ship carrying aid is expected to head to Gaza from Cyprus this weekend. The European Union's maritime mission is in addition to U.S. airdrops, which the United Nations says do little to alleviate the suffering. And today, Sweden joined Canada, revealing it will resume payments to UNRWA, despite an investigation into allegations its staff were involved in the October 7th attacks. Redmond Shannon reports.
More aid drops into Gaza and more footage of some of the parachutes apparently failing. Reports on Friday said 5 Gazans died when some crates plunged to the ground. Not only can the drops be dangerous, the United Nations says the volume will do little to help the more than 500,000 people it says are on the brink of famine. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food says the videos of airdrops only serve domestic political purposes in the US. With Israel still blocking most aid trucks from crossing via land, sea is now the last option. This Spanish tugboat will leave port in Cyprus this weekend, towing 200 tons of supplies, although it's not clear how it will dock. A US plan to build a temporary port could take 2 months to complete. On Saturday, Sweden joined Canada in restoring funding to the UN's relief agency in Gaza. UNRWA faces an ongoing investigation into allegations some staff were involved in the October 7th Hamas attacks.
The decision is in recognition of the serious and significant processes that the United Nations has undertaken to address the issues in UNRWA.
The head of UNRWA says he's optimistic other nations will follow, but Canada's most prominent Jewish organisation says it will challenge Ottawa's decision in court, saying no Canadian taxpayer funds should go to organisations with ties to hate, terror, violence and anti-Semitism. Amid louder calls for a two-state solution, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says he wants Spain to become one of the few Western European countries to formally recognise the State of Palestine. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office says he spoke with Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz on Friday. Trudeau told Gantz Canada wants more aid to reach people in Gaza, and he again raised concerns about the humanitarian implications of Israel's planned offensive on the city of Rafah. Neetu?
Redmond Shannon in London tonight. Thanks, Redmond. US, French and British forces downed at least 28 drones in the Red Sea region overnight and again today after Yemen's Iran-backed Houthis targeted a bulk carrier and US destroyers. Houthi rebels have been attacking ships in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden since November in solidarity with Gaza. There is no reprieve to Russia's assault in Ukraine. Overnight, a Russian strike hit a row of residential buildings in the southern city of Kherson, injuring at least 1 child. Russia is advancing further west after seizing Avdiivka last month and is ramping up artillery attacks as it gains momentum on the battlefield, with Kyiv running low on ammunition and heavy equipment. Ukraine's allies in the west are delicately raising the prospect of sending troops into Ukraine. Poland's foreign minister said Friday the presence of NATO troops in Ukraine is, quote, not unthinkable. Last month, French President Emmanuel Macron said the possibility of Western troops being sent to Ukraine could not be ruled out. Russia has warned if NATO sends combat troops in, a direct conflict between the alliance and Russia would be inevitable. Sweden finally has what it wants, a NATO membership, which bolsters the alliance's northern flank. In the eastern flank, in Latvia, Canada has its largest NATO mission, Operation Reassurance. The feds want to boost Canada's military presence there with more troops, but as Mercedes Stevenson tells us, the armed forces is having a tough time recruiting new members. Mercedes?
Neither Defense Minister Bill Blair surprised a room full of military brass and allies in Ottawa this week when I sat down with him to talk about the state of the Canadian Armed Forces at a major defense conference. What Minister Blair had to say about the state of the Canadian Armed Forces is the furthest I've ever heard a sitting defense minister go in admitting just how dire the situation is for our troops. Speaking to the crisis of recruiting and retention, Blair didn't mince his words.
If what you have been doing for decades is no longer working for you, you can't just keep doing it. And over the past 3 years, more people have left than have entered. That is frankly, it's a death spiral for the Canadian Armed Forces.
This week on the West Block, we sit down with former Chief of the Defense Staff, retired General Tom Lawson, to talk about Minister Blair's comments, the shortage of troops, and the news that almost half of the Canadian military's equipment has been deemed unavailable and unserviceable. Lawson has one creative idea to at least try to attract and keep more people.
Nobody says the Canadian Armed Forces are overpaid. So I think that there's an opening there to make the Armed Forces not only okay paid, but remarkably well paid with remarkable benefits so that you can compete with any organization.
One of the people in the room to hear Minister Blair's comments was Latvia's defense minister. He's of course come to Canada from a country which is directly exposed to Russian aggression every day. Latvia's defense minister Spruce had some thoughts on Canada not meeting its 2% in terms of NATO spending targets.
2% is important. It's important in a wider NATO context. It's important because it shows there is solidarity and threat assessment and understanding that there are common things that we should do together actively, and of course fair burden sharing is very important. It is also about credibility.
We'll find out just how much the government may ramp up military spending in the anticipated federal budget, which is coming in April.
Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa. Thanks, Mercedes. Police in northwestern Nigeria say armed men have broken into another school and abducted 15 children. It comes just 48 hours after nearly 300 students were seized in another mass abduction. 28 of those students have reportedly managed to escape. Nigeria's security forces are stretched thin, fighting an Islamist insurgency in the region. Mass fish kill coming up, investigating the mystery behind hundreds turning up dead in a section of the St. Lawrence River. Parts of eastern Newfoundland, including St. John's, are covered in snow after roughly 50 centimeters fell in 2 days. Another 20 centimeters is expected by morning, coupled with wind gusts up to 70 kilometers an hour. The storm is the second to very eastern parts of the province in less than a month, and there's more messy weather expected Monday. In Quebec, there has been a mass fish kill in a section of the St. Lawrence River near Montreal. Water levels there have suddenly dropped to the lowest levels in decades. Tonight, Dan Spector looks at what else could have caused the deaths.
A few weeks ago, Gina Philly was walking the shores of the St. Lawrence looking for trash to pick up when she had a terrible realization. She was stepping on hundreds of dead fish.
It's not normal that there's so many dead animals on the shore.
The director of a local environmental organization, she started documenting the damage immediately.
So many carcasses that you get a feeling that you're not really feeling good.
After some steady rain, the water is higher now, but she says that day it was so low she could have walked all the way to the island she's pointing to.
There was no water at all here.
So that's completely abnormal. Dr. Philippe says many fish got caught out of the water. Waste and a lack of oxygen could have also contributed to their deaths. Some got stuck in small pools like this.
A few weeks back when it was like -10, well, all this froze over. So any fish that might have made it in these little pools will probably just died right there.
Other creatures like crustaceans, mussels, insects, and this small turtle were left totally exposed.
Massacre every year, it's not normal.
According to Blair, die-offs here are an annual occurrence. The scientist says the St. Lawrence Seaway Authority lowers the water at the Côte St. Catherine Lock during the winter months, but accused them of lowering it even more this year.
We'd like to know exactly what the reason is.
The Seaway Authority says it controls water levels during the winter period of non-navigation for infrastructure maintenance purposes. It says reduced ice cover and water evaporation related to warmer weather conditions, combined with the other factors related to climate change, would have all contributed to the observed situation. Fisheries and Oceans Canada told Global News in a statement it received a report about the low waters and dead fish on March 1st and will be in contact with St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation for further information.
Without an inquiry, we can't really be sure of what happened.
The environmentalists hope Fisheries and Oceans Canada conducts a meaningful investigation into the problem so it can be prevented in the future. Dan Spector, Global News, Brossard, Quebec.
The federal government is slashing its national beer tax just weeks ahead of its planned increase.
Our government will be extending this 2% cap on the excise duty for an additional 2 years.
The alcohol excise tax, which also includes duties on spirits and wines, was set to go up by 4.7% on April 1st. Similar to last year, it will now be capped at 2%. Freeland also announced changes to the excise tax for beer brewed in Canada, cutting that in half for the next 2 years. Ahead, the satellite launch marking a new era in methane accountability, aiming to combat the climate crisis. When it comes to global warming, methane traps about 30 times more heat in the atmosphere than the same volume of carbon dioxide. World leaders pledged earlier this year to reduce methane emissions, but how do you hold them accountable? As Mike Trollet reports, a new satellite will be capable of spotting methane leaks in real time, and the data will be available to anybody with a computer.
Invisible to the naked eye, yet devastating as an agent of global warming, methane makes up 1/3 of the gases heating the planet.
And liftoff Falcon 9.
Earlier this week, US-based NGO Environmental Defense provided a huge piece to the methane puzzle with the launch of a new satellite with the ability to accurately pinpoint the source of emissions. The network of satellites currently being used aren't very accurate, and the data they do collect takes too long to process. But what really makes methane stat a game changer is that anybody will be able to access the data on Google Earth.
We are entering a new era of transparency, and it's really going to help us, as NGOs working with governments to inform policy and reduce those emissions.
We're now aiming for at least 75% reduction.
Canada was aggressive in its methane reducing promises at the most recent UN climate change conference, pledging to reduce emissions 75% by 2030, above the 30% goal set for most countries. Methane emissions largely come from leaks or gas flares, as oil is pulled from the earth.
I've been to 15, 20 countries over the last 2 to 3 years working on oil and gas methane emissions, and the stuff that I see in the US, the stuff that I see in Europe, it's all the same. It's all the same problems. It's easy to fix. I mean, we're talking about plumbing problems for the most part.
The current data shows methane flares emanating from Alberta's oil and gas industry, but those pale in comparison to hotspots in other parts of the world. The major players when it comes to leaks are China, Russia, and the US, and it's not even close. The question is, if major players in countries with fewer regulations will act on the information methane stat provides.
It is going to be uneven. We are going to see methane emissions continuing to increase, probably in some jurisdictions. But by being able to demonstrate in Canada we can reduce emissions, that will make it easier to do it elsewhere as well. We can show what are the practices, what are the technologies to reduce methane emissions.
When it goes online in 2025, methane stat won't plug any leaks, but it will hold companies and countries accountable. Mike Trollet, Global News, Toronto.
Next, from Montreal to Hollywood's red carpet, the emotional journey of a Canadian short film nominated for an Oscar.
내가 널 찾았을까? 내가 사귀었을까? 헤어졌을까?
Canadian director Celine Song's debut film, Past Lives, a decade-spanning romance hailed as one of 2023's best movies. It's nominated for Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay at tomorrow's Academy Awards. Song is far from the only Canadian filmmaker getting nods at Hollywood's biggest night. Among them is Toronto's Nisha Pahuja for her film To Kill a Tiger, nominated for Best Documentary Feature, while The Last Repair Shop, co-directed by Halifax's Ben Proudfoot, is up for Best Documentary Short. Among them is also Vincent René Lortie, whose film Invincible is nominated for Best Live-Action Short. And as Mike Armstrong explains, the Montreal director's film is a very personal story that he felt compelled to share with the world.
Vincent René Lortie, live-action short film, Invincible.
There hasn't been much sleep of late for Vincent René Lortie. The Quebec director's first big event in LA was the Oscar nominee luncheon that included a surreal selfie snapped by Steven Spielberg.
I'm not gonna lie, it's been a lot of surprise. Like, this whole Oscar thing has been unexpected for us. Like, we never expected to be here.
Invincible is a haunting, true, and personal story. It's the last 48 hours in the life of a teenage boy in youth detention. The main character is based on René Lortie's best friend growing up, who died by suicide.
The problem wasn't his family, it wasn't the people that worked at the Juvenile Center. It's really more the story of someone who feels like he's in a world that cannot accept him.
Making the movie took 6 years, but it came with a sort of healing. René Lortie dealt with grief, and not only his own. The film was shot in the same detention center where his friend had been held, and where some of the staff still works.
This story was important to them. They lost someone, and there was a lot of grieving for them as well. It was really difficult.
Now, there were serious struggles making the movie and releasing it, enough that René Lortie says he came close to giving up filmmaking.
Now,
well, instead, it caught fire, to the point where his team sat down as the Oscar nominations were announced and didn't have to wait long. Now, there are heavyweights in the category, some major studios and big directors. René Lortie says he doesn't expect to win, but that he will let himself carry some hope down the red carpet.
Thinking that a little Canadian film is going to change everything is a bit hard to believe, but yeah, we'll see.
Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And that is Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Neetu Gupta. Tonight's Air Canada is this CN train passing through Rothesay, New Brunswick. A reminder, daylight savings begins for most of the country early tomorrow, so don't forget to move your clocks forward by an hour. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great night.
A ship carrying desperately needed humanitarian aid is awaiting the go-ahead to set sail for Gaza along a new sea route from Cyprus. Hopes of a ceasefire for the start of Ramadan meanwhile appear all but over.
Police and palace guards in Haiti tried to retake control of parts of the capital, Port-au-Prince, amid unrelenting gang violence with hundreds of thousands of residents displaced and others struggling to access food, water and basic goods. And a third mass abduction in Nigeria in a week, with gunmen kidnapping 15 pupils in the northwestern Sokoto state. This 2 days after more than 280 students were taken in Kaduna state, and an estimated 200 displaced people kidnapped in Borno. Hello, good evening to you wherever you're watching. Thanks for joining us here on France 24. First up, a charity vessel carrying desperately needed humanitarian aid is ready to set sail for Gaza. The Spanish ship, Open Arms, is awaiting the green light to depart from Cyprus on a new sea corridor backed by the EU, the US, Britain and the UAE. International frustration has been growing with Israeli restrictions on aid to Gaza. After 5 months of Israel's war, civilians are facing the threat of famine in a territory already blockaded for more than a decade. Nick Rushworth has the latest.
It is moored at port in Larnaca in Cyprus. The vessel Open Arms aims to deliver 200 tons of food aid to Palestinians in Gaza. If it sets sail, it will be the first shipment along an EU-backed maritime humanitarian corridor.
The important thing is that this route is open and that food and medicine can arrive continuously, to be able to fulfill basic needs and guarantee that human rights are respected.
Open Arms is working with another charity, World Central Kitchen, which has teams in Gaza organising a dock to unload the aid. The UN warns, however, that the supplies that can be delivered by sea will do little, if anything, to stave off famine in Gaza. It warns of an explosion of child deaths. This mother of 6 children in Gaza City says she lacks food for herself and her children, including her newborn daughter.
I feed my daughter with water just so she doesn't die. Water is not recommended, and it's even forbidden for a baby of her age. Even at 4, 5, 6 months it's forbidden. But I have no choice, so she doesn't die.
This pharmacist says the Israel-Hamas war has led to malnutrition among pregnant and breastfeeding women.
As a pharmacist, for most of the war, around 50 to 70% of the cases that come to the pharmacy are people looking for milk or Cerelac infant cereal.
The health ministry in Hamas-run Gaza says 23 children have died from malnutrition and dehydration so far, linked to the conflict that began on the 7th of October.
Hopes of a ceasefire in Gaza for the start of Ramadan are all but over, with the latest round of Cairo talks producing no results. Hamas authorities say over 31,000 people have now been killed in Gaza as Israel continues its strikes across the strip. Shadi Sipon brings us this update.
One of Rafah's largest residential buildings is in ruins. As Israel presses on with its operations and bombings in the Gaza Strip, some 300 people who lived here had to flee their homes in the middle of the night.
The Israelis ordered to evacuate the place in 5 or 10 minutes. We fled, women and children. We were terrified. We just reached the Rafah municipality and the bombing started. There was a second strike 5 minutes later and a third strike 5 minutes later. Frankly, as you see, there is total destruction.
We were aware it was coming, then they told us to leave. The whole tower is full of residents, all 80 apartments. We ran downstairs. Children, women, elderly, the youth, everyone. We didn't take anything with us. We just ran a very short distance, and then they struck the tower.
Gazans from across the enclave have fled to Rafah to escape the bombings and fighting in their hometowns. 1 million people here have been desperate for food, water, and aid, and the area is under immense pressure. Talks on a ceasefire and the release of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas have so far failed to bring results. And with the Israeli officials saying this city is where the hostages are held and that fighting on the ground could extend to this area too, many fear the situation could further deteriorate. World powers, including Israel's allies and weapon suppliers, have warned against a ground offensive in Rafah.
Israel has criticized Canada and Sweden for resuming aid to the United Nations Palestinian Relief Agency. The Israeli Foreign Ministry said supporting UNRWA was a serious mistake and repeated allegations that its staff in Gaza were complicit in the 7th of October attacks. Around 15 countries suspended donations over Israel's accusations. Canada and Sweden said they were resuming funding because of the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. The European Union has also resumed funding. Meanwhile, Israel appears to be no closer to liberating the remaining hostages taken during the Hamas attacks, a so-called sacred mission for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On Saturday, thousands of protesters came out again in Tel Aviv to demand the government do more to secure their release and to call for Netanyahu to go.
We want to see the hostages back home, and then we need peace, we need quiet, we need everything to be as calm as possible.
They endanger our security, the economy, the relation between us, the Israelis. We have a Prime Minister that his only interest is himself and his family.
In other news, at least 5 civilians have been killed in southern Lebanon in what local media said was an Israeli strike on a house. 4 of the dead were from the same family and 9 more were wounded. Lebanon's Iran-backed Hezbollah group and Israel have traded cross-border fire on a near-daily basis since the 7th of October Hamas attacks. Now, in other world news, police and palace guards in Haiti have been fighting to retake control of parts of the capital, Port-au-Prince, amid an unrelenting gang attacks. The violence has paralyzed the country for over a week and upended life for residents. Food, water, and basic goods are quickly running out in what's already one of the poorest countries in the world. A group of 15 Caribbean states has called an emergency meeting on Monday in Jamaica to discuss the dire situation. Jenny Shin tells us more.
Schools, banks, and gas stations with shuttered doors as Haiti's capital remains in a state of emergency. Gangs have rampaged through Port-au-Prince, freeing thousands of inmates from the country's 2 biggest prisons, attacking its main airport, and setting police stations on fire. Now they exert de facto authority over some 80% of the capital, and the fresh wave of violence has paralyzed the already ailing economy.
The gangs forced me to leave my home. I've become a nomad with my 3 children who don't have a father. I'm all over the streets. We arrived here, but we can't stay because there's no water, no bathrooms, and there's no drinkable water. We're in misery.
Acting Prime Minister Ariel Henry has been in Puerto Rico after his trip to Kenya for talks on gang violence, but remains unable to return to the country. An alliance of Caribbean nations, CARICOM, says it still recognizes Henry as the legitimate leader.
The heads of government of the Caribbean community remain engaged in deep discussions with the various stakeholders in Haiti and Prime Minister Henry. Whilst we are making considerable progress, the stakeholders are not yet where they need to be. We would like the Haitian people to know that we'll continue to work with them on their behalf.
The Prime Minister has accepted to hold early elections in 2025, but gangs have stepped up their attacks on security forces, pushing for a quicker transition. Scores of people have been killed and more than 15,000 forced from their homes since coordinated gang attacks began at the end of last month.
There's been a third mass abduction in Nigeria in the past week after government took 15 pupils from a school in the northwestern Sokoto state. This comes 2 days after the abduction of more than 280 students in Kaduna state. The army has been deployed there to the Kuriga area to search for them. Days earlier, another mass abduction with at least 200 displaced people taken in the northeastern Borno state. With more, here's France 24's Chinwe Osondu in Abuja.
Police authorities in the state of Sokoto have confirmed the incident that it happened around 1 a.m. when the bandits invaded Ida Kazuro in the local government of Gadar in Sokoto. And as they were on their way out of the town, they sighted the students who were rushing into their rooms and adopted. Some of them, most reports say 15 in number. The Islamic school belongs to Malam Liman Abubakar, who confirmed the adoption. According to him, there are 15 unaccounted students so far, and they are still counting. He also explained that the bandits shot one person and adopted a woman. Police authorities have mobilized to the village to secure operations to ensure that the children are back on herd. And as you mentioned earlier on, today's abduction is the latest in the renewed kidnapping of students in Nigeria. Earlier in the week, bandits took away over 280 students in Kaduna State and also 200 internally displaced women in Borno who were also adopted while they were fetching firewood in the bush. The situation is worrisome, it's alarming. The incident has drawn condemnation from wide and near, including UNICEF, Amnesty International, and a host of other agencies and personalities. The U.S. is offering help to make sure that the students are back to their families unhurt. And President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has also issued a statement that the security agency should make sure that these children are rescued immediately.
Next up, presidential hopefuls have kicked off their campaigns in Senegal after weeks of violence sparked by President Macky Sall's spontaneous delay. 19 approved candidates now have a shorter period to rally support ahead of the 24th of March election. It's expected to be the most tightly contested race since Senegal gained independence more than 6 decades ago. Here in France, President Emmanuel Macron was in Lille to launch his party's campaign for EU parliamentary elections on Saturday. The elections are a key milestone for the Renaissance Party ahead of the next presidential elections here in 2027, in which the far-right's Marine Le Pen is expected to announce a fourth bid. And Portugal goes to the polls this Sunday for a snap general election following the resignation of Prime Minister Antonio Costa in November. The two main parties, the centre-left Socialists and the centre-right Social Democrats, are once again expected to dominate, but a radical right populist party could emerge as kingmaker. Polls have Chega winning some 16% of the vote, which could help propel Europe's tilt to the right. More from Eliza Herbert.
Campaigning has ended, ballot boxes are ready, and over 10 million registered voters are taking to the polls in Portugal, with some optimistic that gains for the right might be on the cards after 8 years of socialist rule.
I think the change from the Socialist Party to moderate right-wing and ideally centre-right party is important for Portugal. The Socialist Party has been in power for quite a long time without any result.
The two main parties are expected to capture most of the votes. The ruling Socialist Party, whose new leader Pedro Nuno Santos wants to keep his party in power, and the centre-right Democratic Alliance led by Luis Montenegro. However, one outsider has been dominating the headlines, Andre Ventura. His far-right party, Chega, which stands for Enough, has run a campaign aimed at leveraging widespread political discontent to overthrow decades of bipartisan leadership. Under the slogan, Portugal needs a clean-up, he's championed anti-corruption, stricter immigration rules, and even chemical castration for pedophiles. And polls suggest it may have worked, enough to receive some 16% of votes, making him decisive in subsequent coalition talks if the election yields no clear winner. But not all voters are convinced.
I don't think we're in a period of great significant change. The truth is, the outgoing party is bound to come back to power with a programme that's not really any different from what we've got.
Sunday's snap election was triggered when former Prime Minister Antonio Costa stepped down last November amid allegations of corruption. The implosion brought the party's ratings below 30%, just behind the Democratic Alliance.
That's it for this bulletin, but the news continues here on France 24. Don't go away.
The unspeakable horror of Israel's war endured by Gaza's most vulnerable. An Israeli airstrike kills women and children, sheltering in a refugee camp in central Gaza. Hello there, I'm Anastasia Tay, and this is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming in. The Palestinian Health Ministry says famine in northern Gaza has reached dangerous levels, with 25 people dying of hunger and dehydration. In Haiti, at least 15,000 people are displaced from their homes after gang violence grips the capital. And a shattered community in Nigeria demands answers from their government after the abduction of nearly 300 school children. From north to south, Israeli forces have unleashed widespread devastation across Gaza and targeted residential areas yet again. Nearly 100 Palestinians have been killed in the last 24 hours. One airstrike hit a house in the Nusayrat refugee camp where 21 displaced Palestinians were sheltering. At least 13 women and children were killed. Michael Apple reports.
This is the impact crater from an Israeli airstrike on a home in Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza. Rescue teams know people are trapped.
We have just recovered the dead body of a baby only a few months old, but we have not yet been able to find any others.
A 4-year-old girl is freed from the home that collapsed around her. There's one last kiss from her grandfather. She's taken to an ambulance, but it's already too late. And she isn't the only one. The lifeless body of 6-year-old Omar lies beside her.
To the Israelis, there is no safe zone all over the Gaza Strip. Not a single inch is safe. The Israelis are lying. We were told that from the Gaza Valley southward is safe. We were forced to take shelter there. We are all civilians. All those inside the house were women and children. I was the oldest and the only male among them. I repeat, all were women and children.
He's asked what his message is for the world that's watching.
There is nothing called the international community. This is a lie. There is nothing called the international court or international humanitarian law. All of these are just lies. All these names were created to back the strong against the weak, the oppressor against the oppressed.
Teams continue to dig for any survivors, knowing full well there is little chance anyone could have survived this. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera.
Well, further south from the Nusayrat refugee camp in Rafah, the Israeli military is continuing to target areas that are previously deemed safe for civilians. Anxiety of residents asked to leave, as Ferdy Carr reports.
The evacuation of Al Masri Tower in Rafah is captured on a mobile phone. Israeli airstrikes hit the building where 300 displaced Palestinians were seeking temporary refuge. Residents say they received a 30-minute warning to get out. But it wasn't enough time, sparking panic and chaos.
We were surprised at night with the janitor knocking on the apartment doors telling us to evacuate the tower. Our children and our women fell. A friend of mine's wife, who's 9 months pregnant, she fell downstairs. There was a state of panic and fear. People left everything. Some even forgot their children.
In the daylight, the extent of the damage is huge. Among the debris, people find themselves sitting with their belongings, many of whom were already displaced and now have nowhere to turn.
Where is the safe place they speak about? Where should people go? From the north, they told them to evacuate to the south. They herded them all up in the south, in Khan Yunis, and told them to go to Rafah. Where is the safe place that the Israeli army is talking about?
Israel's raids continue across Gaza, killing dozens of civilians, including attacks in Deir al-Balah. The US and Jordanian air forces and others continue to airdrop supplies into Gaza, but some parachutes fail to open, killing several people waiting on the ground.
We do not want anybody to give us food. We want them to leave us alone, and we can survive on our own. These rockets that fall on us are American rockets to begin with.
In all the hardship, this father finds a spark of joy. After 91 days apart, he's reunited with his son Hamza, promising never to let him go again. Ferdy Carr, Al Jazeera.
Well, in northern Gaza, a man-made famine caused by Israel's restrictions on life-saving aid has now led to 25 Palestinian deaths. 20-year-old Shireen Abu Hazza passed away at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. A toddler died in Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza. The situation there is dire, with warnings that famine is spreading at an alarming rate.
Because of the shortage of nutrition and water, she fell ill. She had a chronic condition and required fresh fruits, vegetables and meat. Unfortunately, none were available. We lacked the finances and means to provide these necessities for her, which ultimately led to her passing.
Regrettably, she succumbed to dehydration and malnutrition. Moreover, she suffered from a chronic disease, and given that we have been in war for the 6th consecutive month, we are now running out of the medication she required. We encounter similar cases every day, including both young and elderly individuals. They are losing their lives due to malnutrition and a lack of medication.
Well, the humanitarian crisis across Gaza is worsening by the hour. Palestinians are being forced to survive with little or no water. In Rafah, people have been desperately lining up to get water from supply trucks. Israel's unrelenting attacks have destroyed pipes across the strip. Rights groups accuse Israel of using water and food as weapons of war.
On regular days, we can barely get water, so not sure about the coming months of Ramadan. That's a general problem. In the camp, we have sick children who need sugars and protein. Our children are getting dizzy. I swear for the last 5 months, we've not seen a single egg or meat. The sweet things never arrive.
Well, meanwhile, airdrops of aid have continued for another day. Aid agencies say they are neither efficient nor enough to meet the needs of people as long as Israel continues to block aid trucks. Some Palestinians say aid packages are falling into the sea with no way of retrieving them. On Friday, at least 5 people were hit and killed by faulty airdrops after parachutes failed to open.
There's no food or water up in northern Gaza. They dropped some bottles of water, but we need food. We are starving, I swear to God. We are literally dying of hunger. Please help us. Come to our rescue. We don't need water. We need food. Why are they dropping food in the sea? We need it dropped on the ground. We just want something to fill our stomachs. We want bread. We want flour. Anything.
I have orphans. I need to feed them. Have mercy on us. Have mercy on us.
The issue of aid is brutal and no one accepts it. There are isolated areas and most of the aid falls and drowns in the sea and no one gets anything. There is also no transportation as the roads are damaged. We want better methods.
More now from Al Jazeera's Anas Al Sharif in northern Gaza.
A short while ago, planes dropped humanitarian aid in an agricultural area in Beit Lahia, northern Gaza. Women, men and children rushed to the area in hopes of obtaining aid as starvation escalates and food becomes increasingly scarce. Since this morning, a large number of people have been desperately waiting for the airdrop aid. However, many were unable to access it as thousands rushed to the area.
We're anxiously awaiting planes to drop water, rice, and any other food. However, it's just a drop in the ocean, and it doesn't meet our needs. Only one person out of 100 can secure some of this aid to take home. It's barely enough for one person. Some have managed to take something home, but most have returned empty-handed. As we enter the holy month of Ramadan, hunger is gripping the Strip. I urge all Arabs and those with a conscience to act and end this war on Gaza.
We don't need this airdrop food. We are running from place to place. Open the border crossings. Allow food into the Strip, especially with Ramadan approaching. People are dying. Children are starving. How can Arab countries allow this?
I travelled from Tel Zatar hoping to get just one package for my siblings who are crying from hunger, yet the aid is dropped in the sea or far away. I still haven't obtained a single package for my siblings. What's a widow like my mother supposed to do to feed her children? There must be a way for the needy to access this aid.
This is the current situation in northern Gaza after the aid was airdropped. It remains insufficient to meet the needs of hundreds of thousands of desperate people.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Woodman. Have a good life.